Again, my name is Jerry Jackson. I'm over the Managed Care Division here at Medicaid. Although there's not a start date for implementation of the RCO, Medicaid continues to work on projects that are related to the RCO implementation, and IPS is a key project that we've continued that work on. The agency met with probationary RCOs 2 weeks ago to provide an update and clarification. Today, an update and clarification will be presented to providers, and there will also be a question and answer session at the end. At this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Tommy Carlisle with Navigant, Dustin Schmidt with Navigant, and Drew Nelson with Medicaid Managed Care.
Thanks, Jerry. We appreciate the opportunity to spend the lunch hour with our providers and the probationary RCOs today. We do have a brief presentation, and as the moderator and others have mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end. So we expect to get through the presentation fairly quickly. So if you have questions that come up, write them down, and we'll reference back to those toward the end of the session today. It's been several months. It was early May when we last met with providers related to the integrated provider system. We want to kind of briefly go through the agenda today to update you. I know you're aware, but the primary goals of the IPS program, the available funding, some time frames, although as Jerry's already mentioned, we don't have definitive dates because of the delay, but we're hoping shortly based on some successful things happening in the legislature that we'll have some dates that we can share. And real importantly today, after meeting with probationary RCOs in the last couple of weeks, we want to use this delay period in a productive way and enable providers to continue to pursue very actively their projects. So related to our next slide, I'm not going to read this off to you, but just to kind of refresh the goals. Everybody knows IPS is a very integral part of the statewide Medicaid transformation. Back in February of this year, as you know, the governor had announced that CMS had approved the 1115 waiver that the state had been working diligently on for a couple of years. And in that demonstration, which is a lot of information, in terms of the approval, the STCs, the protocols, there is a lot of information that is out on the website related to the overall demonstration, but also related to the IPS program. We're not going to be able to touch on all that today, but the 4 primary goals there to the left of the waiver are articulated. On the right side, very important, are the quality measures, and those will be statewide quality measures that we will be gauged on as a state, which has an impact on the amount of funding. It's been well publicized that the federal government has made a commitment of approximately $750 million, $750 million over a 5-year period. There are some limitations in that if the state does not in subsequent years of the demonstration hit certain targets. So you can see it's a total team effort between the state, providers, RCOs, that we need to work together as a team, and the IPS is a very integral part of that. Quickly, the funding there on this slide shows that the IPS portion represents approximately $278 million. I think you are also aware that there is a $50 million pool for RCO startup costs that's not reflected on this chart. So really, to initiate the transformation in the early part, the first 3 years of the demonstration, about $328 million in total is dedicated to the startup cost and to the IPS. You will see in demonstration year 1, of course, those dates will be changing, and I believe we do have that footnoted. Although the current demonstration is approved for an April 1 start date, that is very likely to change, and we will be updating you with those. But if you look at the $137.5 million to be dispersed to IPS providers and RCOs in the first year, and you add in the $50 million for RCO startup because that our 11 probationary RCOs have already spent a lot of dollars to stand up RCOs. You'll see that close to $200 million of those funds, or about 60%, the federal government has given the state the approval to disperse those very early on in the demonstration. And I think that's very important for the fact that they realize that the quicker that we can implement some of these programs in our state, the greater impact that that will have. If you look on the right side of the slide, we've gone over this before, but it just shows you the funding by region that is available. That is based on the number of beneficiaries served in a particular region to the total beneficiaries within the state. So you will see, for instance, that Region B is the Birmingham metropolitan area. They serve the largest number of beneficiaries, so they have the largest pool of IPS dollars available to those providers and to those RCOs that will be within that region. The next slide, again, a little guidance, and Dustin will be getting into more of the details about where some of this guidance can be found. But the main focus, with these dollars is to have a direct, sustainable impact on the healthcare system within the state of Alabama. A couple things that the state has clarified before and wanted to remind again is that the state will not approve duplicative projects in an RCO region, and we encourage providers as well as RCOs to work together. This will be facilitated in large part when the collaboration process begins when you select your RCO sponsor. For instance, if you are a provider in a region and you have a project that only includes your particular organization, it is very likely that once you begin the collaboration process with your RCO, that there are others that have similar projects, and you would be encouraged to work together to have a greater impact on the beneficiaries within that region. And something that has changed, the last bullet point on here, since you submitted the LOIs to the probationary RCOs back in mid-April, after discussion with probationary RCOs, the state and the RCOs thought it was a more streamlined process if you only selected one RCO within a region to work with, that the administrative burden on the RCOs would be less, and it would give you a chance to go ahead and begin that collaboration process. We have the next slide up is a timeline. The timeline is kind of broken into two parts. If you look at the right side of the timeline there, and we'll be making these slides available so you'll have that, so you don't have to write all this down, but it's basically the same timeline that was put forth back in early May. One thing you'll remember is that it was a very, very tight deadline. I think from the time that we met on May the 10th, there was 51 days until that application originally was due on July 1st. Of course, the delay has afforded us a chance to kind of revisit, and there's several things that have been added and a little bit additional time that has been added, but it's basically showing on that right side that we expect that it'll be about a 6-month process. The month or so that has been added is to make the process a little bit more doable for providers and RCOs. The evaluation and scoring and the IPS award announcements, that's the same time frame. I would like to point out a couple of things that have changed. If you look at the 6 months where it says mandatory, we've already talked about it. We are now asking that you only submit an application to one RCO within the region. Another addition has been, if you go above that, that within about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks of submitting your application or your sections to the RCO that you've chosen to work with, that they have to get back in writing and to notify the state if they're going to work with you based on all the evaluation that they will be doing. We've also added a quality assurance committee section to this. Within a short period of time, if you were not chosen as a project with your sponsoring RCO. You can appeal that under certain circumstances to the Quality Assurance Committee with the state, and within a period of time they will reevaluate that, and if it is determined that that project is something that should be evaluated, you would then go back and work with your particular RCO to complete that process, and you would have about 6 weeks to do that. So those are the changes that have happened to the original timeline. And really importantly today, the thing that we want to really stress is that to use the time of the delay productively. After our meetings with the probationary RCOs, we made the decision that we would have an optional time frame of a couple of months that you could begin to submit projects and work and collaborate with your RCOs. And I think that would really make the process so much easier once we get a new established go-live date and we begin the formal mandatory process. So it is at this point I'll turn it over to my colleague Dustin, and then we'll revisit in a bit.
Thanks, Tommy. So as Tommy discussed, in order to begin the collaboration process, the RCOs and the agencies recommend that interested providers submit a draft IPS application to one RCO within a region by October 3rd. And please note that this step is optional but recommended, and that mandatory deadlines will be announced at a later date once more is known about the RCO go-live date. And related to the October 3rd interim submission, the table on the right shows what sections of the IPS application we recommend that you complete prior to your submission to an RCO. And in this table, we excluded certain sections that are RCO specific or that would require RCO collaboration. And for sake of time, I'm just going to touch on a few of these sections quickly. So for example, Section 3, beneficiary impact, we would recommend that you submit all sections by the October 3rd deadline. And this section includes a description of beneficiaries impacted and then also the number of beneficiaries impacted by the proposed IPS project. Section 4, which is the work plan, so we would recommend you submit all sections completed. But as it relates to Section 4.1, this would only include the major milestones. So the start and end dates should just reflect the amount of time to complete an activity and not the specific dates, which is how the current IPS application suggests. In Section 7, we recommend that you provide an estimated budget, which would be all sections minus Section 7.3, which is related to the RCO's use of funds. In Section 8, which is return on investment, we only recommend that you complete Section 8.3, which is a description of your IPS, of how your IPS project will be sustainable. At this time, we do not recommend that you calculate your return on investment unless you have already done so. Section 11, this is related to existing grants that you all may have. So this is only applicable if it relates to your project. And this section relates to any existing grants that you all may be receiving that may be duplicative of the proposed IPS project that you submit. And Tommy talked about just the resources that we have available, but all interested providers should visit the agency's IPS webpage for materials and other guidance documents. And just a couple of things I wanted to highlight here. So CMS recently approved the agency's IPS protocols and the IPS application. We haven't updated the protocols to reflect the new dates and such, but once we learn more about what the RCO program go-live date is, we would update that document as well as other documents that we have posted on the agency's IPS webpage. If you're interested in learning about the IPS program, we have posted presentations. So we have the previous presentation we did for you all back in, I believe it was April or May. We have the IPS protocols, which describes in quite a bit of detail what the IPS program is. And then we also have the IPS guidance document. Those documents and others would be a good starting point to better understand what the IPS program is. As it relates to the IPS application, we did make 2 minor revisions. So you should use the version that is posted on the agency's IPS webpage for when you submit your IPS application to one of the RCOs that you select. And just to quickly go over the minor changes that we made. So in Section 9 of the IPS application, we provided a breakout for some of the RCO quality measures that included multiple rate components. So for example, we originally had one row for the RCO quality measure, prenatal and postpartum care, but now we have two rows to capture the individual rate components, which was timeliness of prenatal care and postpartum care. The second thing we changed was just a minor change to the introduction worksheet, which we removed the due dates and timeline references, being at this point we do not know and have not established what the mandatory due dates and timeline would be. For data requests, if you would like to receive data to support your IPS application development, please reach out to the RCO that you selected, and the RCO can coordinate with the agency regarding any types of data requests. Another point to make here is the FAQ document. The agency tries to keep this up to date, and depending on the number of questions we have, and we typically update this document every 1 to 2 weeks. This slide just identifies the RCO contacts that you all can work with, and there haven't been any changes to this based on the last presentation we gave to you all. I'm going to walk through next steps, which we are defining as optional because the mandatory dates have not been established. Although we identify these as optional, they are very important. As we talked about before, the agency's IPS webpage is a great resource for all of the available information, such as the IPS application, the protocols, which we just discussed, and other materials that the agency will post. You should consider exploring whether your IPS project could be stronger by partnering with other provider types and/or other providers. The agency and the RCO suggest that you start the IPS application development process early and stay engaged, even though we have not established the mandatory dates. And this is essentially why we are recommending that you all move forward and submit a draft IPS application by the October 3rd date. And certainly if you all have any questions, you can email the agency, which we've received several questions through the RCO quality inbox, but you can also email the RCOs directly for any questions that you may have. And the last point I wanted to make here is that you should stay tuned for more information on the mandatory dates associated with the IPS program and the application process. And now I'm going to turn over to Tommy, who will help facilitate the Q&A session that we have.
Your first question comes from the line of Brian Hall. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. One of the earlier slides that has a time frame on it, I just want to make sure that I understood correctly that there would be a 6-month minimum process from the time an application is formally submitted to the time it is the earliest time it could be funded. Can y'all confirm that that's correct, please? Thanks.
Brian, that is correct. Thanks for your question. That after reviewing it and having some additional time to look back, we believe that this timeline would accommodate everything that would be beneficial to providers as well as to the RCOs in the state to adequately evaluate IPS projects. And I'm being told by my colleagues that it could go longer. I mean, there's a lot of variables that are still to be determined. Obviously, the go-live date, but I believe we have footnoted, or at least it's listed on there, that the IPS award date may not necessarily correspond as it has in the past with the actual go-live date of the RCOs. But the state is very mindful that there's been a lot of dollars spent, a lot of time invested, and we'll work diligently to try to make disbursement as soon as possible.
Your next question comes from the line of Tara Edwards. Please go ahead.
I have a question in reference to funding, and maybe it's not to be addressed here. In terms of reimbursement to providers, is there a minimum reimbursement that the RCOs need to provide to the provider community?
Tara, to clarify your question, that if you're a billing provider to an RCO, that will be guided by the RCO regulations, and there is some language in it that there are minimums that would be paid based on the current rates, Medicaid rates in the state of Alabama. Related to the IPS, I'm not sure if I understand the question in that context.
You answered the question. It was not actually related directly to the IPS, but more so the reimbursement to the provider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Your next question comes from the line of Brian Davis. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm struggling a little bit with what the process should be for how we select the one RCO. If we have multiple RCOs in our region that could sponsor an IPS proposal, how do we go about the process of selecting just that one? And between now and October 3rd, I see on this timeline where they have to give written notice back on whether or not they will accept the application, but I'm assuming that's only after the new timeframes are announced.
You know, and that clarification is that we're hopeful that you've already been having contact with the RCOs in your region and that you've discussed your projects. I know the LOIs you could submit, and most did, to the multiple RCOs within the region. So hopefully you've had some conversations determining what your particular region RCOs, their goals are within the region and how that may fit with your particular project. But I think conversation, contact, and discussion is probably the key there for success of choosing the particular RCO. And there may be certain RCOs that have certain strengths that may match up also with what you're trying to accomplish with your project.
Okay, well that's what we're doing right now, so I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything else that we were missing, so I appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you for your question.
And you have a follow-up from Brian Hall. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks again. Just as a follow-up to that timing question, with regards to the budget that's going to be in the application, I'm aware that some of the providers will have projects that will have at least partially started. Of course, when we went into it, everyone was kind of expecting the timeline to be fall. So some of these projects will have already been queued up and started. For the budget that goes in the application, I believe there's a section in there that says no cost done prior to the date should be included in the budget. Will Medicaid be telling us whatever date that is so that we can carve off costs that are before then, or what date should we use? Thank you.
Brian, would you please send that to the RCO portal that is out on the website under IPS so that we can, clarify that and maybe spend some time researching? I think the overall intent, the original start date of the demonstration, which is currently the still active date, is April 1, and I think that was the trigger date. But, generally speaking, you would not start a project until it was approved. And I think that April date that you're talking about was assuming that there would be some kind of feedback on that. But we'll clarify that in writing within the next week or so.
Yeah, I know within just looking at the budget, I don't think we specify I think for what you submit on October 3rd, we didn't specify like the time frame. So I know within the ROI, we have it broken out by year.
We've also received a question from Debbie Hoffman online. She wanted to know how really to choose the regions. What we've actually encouraged all of our providers to do is to look at your panels, particularly those providers who live in one of the counties that might be on the border between RCO regions, and look and see where your patients come from, and sign up with the RCOs where a majority of your recipients come from. If you live in the middle of a single region, then you would obviously encourage you to sign up with the RCOs within that region. But there's also nothing that says you can't sign up with all RCOs in all different regions.
Greg, we did have one question that has repeatedly come up, and we're going to bring up that slide and just go over it. As an IPS funding example, may give some additional time for people to ask questions. But here's an example that the state has put forth here that shows a project after collaboration with, a sponsoring RCO that has been submitted, a $10 million project. That it breaks it down into two components. There are two 10% that are mentioned in the STCs in the protocols. that has caused a little bit of confusion, but in that first box, under this example of a $10 million project, the state will only fund up to 90% of that. So if this project were approved and received the maximum funding of 90%, that would leave $1 million for the RCO and providers to have to fund related to that 10 million project, or about 10%. Now, when you come to the distribution of that award, there's another 10% involved. So the way that this would work out is the RCOs in this example, and we use the maximum according to the STCs that were negotiated with CMS, that a maximum of 10% of that $10 million could be spent on RCO administrative costs. So that would be $900,000 in this example. So under this scenario, with the maximum award for the administration would be $8.1 million that would be paid out to the various providers. So under that scenario, a worst case example of the 10% at the maximum funding, providers would have submitted $9 million in estimated costs. They would receive 8.1 under this scenario, which would mean that they would, with no contribution by the RCO, would mean that providers would get 89% of their requested budget for this particular project. You will see there's a footnote at the bottom, and this has been clarified in a question about project cost and what can be included. So very importantly, the state has identified that it would be not only cash expenditures, but non-cash, cash equivalent for various items that may be provided by a provider. Also remind you that there is another example similar to this out on the website that goes into a little bit more detail, and there's also it talks about the project cost footnote there also, among other questions. That would be under frequently asked questions, IPS frequently asked questions.
You have a question from the line of Scott Williams. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Just a quick question. The period of time between the October 1 deadline for submission and then the 6-month review process, do y'all know what that timeline is? Is that waiting on a start date for the RCOs, or what happens between October 1 or October 3 and that review process?
Scott, you are exactly right. That is not the agency does not know that. I think that we all read this week, in the last couple of days, that the governor had called a special session in mid-August, or at least it's been announced that he was going to call a special session in mid-August. So a lot of that would be based on the legislature obviously determining a successful conclusion to the budget shortfall. So we don't have any additional information at this time, but I do think it's encouraging that it does appear that our legislature and governor are talking.
Your next question comes from the line of Amelia Wolford. Please go ahead.
Yes, if you have the funding split up by the regions, but you have multiple RCOs in the region, how will the money be split between those RCOs in the region? Will it be based on the quality of the IPS applications that come in from those entities, or will it be split up in advance of that? How will that happen?
Amelia, thank you for your question, and I would ask that we go back to slide 6, which we're actually on there, that talks about that. And you're exactly right that you can see that once the applications are submitted to the state, that there's a couple of month process, some public comment, but also a scoring process. There will be an independent evaluator that the state contracts with to actually evaluate those contracts, make recommendations, and then the state will review those and make the final determination. So it will be based on, you can go out, there's a very detailed outline of how the application will be scored, both within the STCs and also within the protocols. So it'd be really good for everybody to refresh themselves on those before submitting or beginning the application process.
Okay, thank you.
Your next question comes from the line of Mitchell Rudish. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if I can get a copy of the presentation, that was all.
Yes, Mitchell, that will be posted within the next day or so, or maybe sooner, on the website along with all the other presentations. Again, I think we did presentations to providers in April, May, and of course this one, so that would be out there in addition to all the other information that the state has put out.
Debbie Hoffman asks, are we required to enroll in order to receive payment?
Debbie, related to that question, you do have to be a Medicaid provider enrolled in the program to receive any IPS funds.
You have to be contracted with the RCO.
And contracted with the RCO in which you're submitting a proposal or a project. Very good. We appreciate your time today with us. And remember, if you have questions, that you can submit those to the RCO portal email address. But the state encourages you first to, talk with your sponsoring RCO, and they most likely will be able to help you and assist before turning to the state. But we are there to help in any way.
We've also received several requests for data or numbers of Medicaid eligibility. We are encouraging all providers, as part of your application, those are some numbers that you need, to work with the RCO that you will be submitting your plan to get that information. So please do not submit requests for data to the agency, but instead to the RCO.
So just for clarification, I think what the state is saying on most things related to IPS, data requests related to IPS, is that first you should go to your sponsoring RCO, collaborate with them, and then if there's further questions, the state can clarify.